Well, my story is...
In 1982, on the 30th of December, right between Christmas and New Year's Eve, a little girl named Katie Beers was born in the town of Mastic Beach, Long Island. But to people familiar with this case, she's ended up being known as the girl in the wall.
Tell me something.
He threw me on the bed.
I just want my daughter back. Please bring her back.
And then I was screaming my brains out.
I heard her say a man was coming after her with a knife, and she said, oh my God, here he comes.
He started kissing me.
Our biggest concern is that we find this child, well and safe.
My hand hit a nail.
The last time I seen her was when she was walking towards the machine. I started getting scared.
Katie Beers, 9 years old, was kidnapped, assaulted, confined, and chained up after being abandoned by her mother, then treated as a slave by her godmother and her sexually perverted husband, before being kidnapped and trapped in an underground dungeon. Long Island cops probed deep into this cast of people, each more questionable than the next, for nearly 3 weeks in the hopes of locating the kidnapped 9-year-old. She's hiding behind the wall. She's hiding behind the wall. She isn't alive. But much to their amazement, she had already begun. She was aware of how to save herself. She tried every trick in the book to persuade him to change his mind, and she eventually won. A 10-year-old child changed the thinking of a kidnapper. Katie, a busy little girl, has a Cinderella-like existence in the small town of Bayshore, Long Island. Her godmother, Linda, and her husband, Sal, have enslaved her since her mother abandoned her. I was their valet. That was my goal, whether it was to wash the laundry, clean the restrooms, or cook dinner. To her maturing, I was essentially her servant. But her service to Linda was secondary, because the true monster in that house was none other than her own uncle. My godmother's husband sexually molested me from the time I was 2 years old. Katie had had enough when she was 7 years old and tried to tell her godmother the truth about her husband, but her reaction just made matters worse. She called me a *****ing liar and urged me to get out of her face. Katie was not permitted to attend school and grew up completely alone. Janice Pizzito, a typical family acquaintance, was her only friend. But their relationship was precious to her. I seldom had any buddies my own age. When I was a kid, I suppose the thing that made me the happiest was spending time with John. I'd say I adored him. He was always a trusted confidant, someone I'd put my trust in. Katie's life was about to take a turn for the worse amongst all of the violence she had already endured. I was kidnapped 2 days before my 10th birthday. Katie was left with John that day, and they went to Spaceplex, her favorite destination on Long Island. You could ride motorcycles, shoot baskets, or even ride a dinosaur at Spaceplex. Big John and I were going to celebrate my 10th birthday together. Local children dubbed John Big John since he was a well-known member of the Big Brother Big Sister program. But her birthday would quickly turn bad, as the worst thing that could happen to a youngster occurred. Linda, Katie's godmother, is the voice crying out her name, but as she was calling the cops, they were already on the scene at Spaceplex with Big John. They evacuated the area and searched for the remainder of the day, but their efforts were futile. Whoever got their hands on her was a really talented person. Katie was forced to crawl till she reached a trap door through a tunnel built behind the walls of his house by an expert. Then he exposes this hole and opens the entrance to this room. The only phrase to describe this room was dungeon, a place from which I couldn't leave. Katie discovered a filthy mattress and a maze inside. A homemade soundproof casket surrounded by chains. My captor turned to face me and stated, "This is your new home." I heard her say a man with a knife was coming after her, and she exclaimed, "Oh my God, here he comes."
Katie.
So when I picked up the phone to call her, I got nothing. This is all Linda had to say about the scary call she received on the day of the abduction. This worried Dominic Verone, the head of the Long Island Police Department's kidnapping division. Katie had already hung up by the time she arrived at the machine. That bothered me since there have been numerous occasions when these abductions were not, in fact, abductions. They may appear to be abductions. He was statistically correct. Do you ever find yourself on a roll? Close family members are responsible for almost 95% of kidnappings. But that wasn't the only odd thing about that phone conversation. It just didn't seem plausible to me. And by that I mean he was bothered by the notion that a 9-year-old youngster would use the word kidnap. Also, how does a 9-year-old youngster escape from an abductor and use the phone? But he had to put his suspicions aside for the time being. Katie was the top priority. They needed to identify her quickly since every minute counts in that kind of situation. Despite my concerns about some of the issues with the call, you definitely hear a girl in distress. This young lady was in danger. Katie was nowhere to be found at Spaceplex, almost as if she had never existed. Verone decided to send out the big guns because the only indication they had was a video of Katie's panicked call to Linda. Verone resumed his research while awaiting the FBI. Naturally, he began by investigating the most likely candidates. The natural mother is the girl in the beer, a chaotic and inept mother. The godmother's name is Linda Inglary. My primary worry is letting everyone know how much I loved her. The godmother employed her to conduct various errands. Larry was charged with sexual assault on Katie Beers. The small girl does not want to live with her mother in a master's speech. However, there was a fourth suspect. Outside of the family, the last male she saw before she was abducted. John Esposito is a family friend, not a relative. He stated that something filthy had occurred. The FBI eventually informed him of their findings. Katie's call appeared to have been made from a phone booth in front of Spaceplex, which is strange given that they had found no evidence of her inside the amusement facility. She also supposedly called Linda 19 times before deciding to leave a message on her answering machine. All of these hints, however, paled in comparison to the outcome of the FBI's audio analysis of the call. The next item of shocking news came from the lab. It was a recording, not Katie, who broke away and made the call. Someone had tape recorded Katie and wanted us to believe or see that the call originated from the phone next to Spaceplex. As the detective began to piece together the puzzle, it became clear that the perpetrator had duped them all. Katie's kidnapping has been exploited as a cover for something even more terrible. The phone call was staged by someone to make us believe Katie Beers had been kidnapped. Katie knew what was going to happen when she returned to the dungeon, and resolved to fight as hard as she possibly could. She went at the casket door after noticing it was loose. I eventually kicked it long enough and hard enough that it snapped, allowing me to safely depart. This was a huge step forward for her. She felt she might finally be able to leave, almost forgetting that the casket itself was inside the dungeon. Then I was stuck with nowhere to go. I recall going on the shelf and seeing if there was anything there that I could use for self-defense. And there were several keys up there, so unintentionally, I took one of those keys and stashed it beneath the mattress. She heard him approaching before she had a chance to think of a method to face him. It was too late now as the footsteps became more louder. He spotted the door open as soon as he came down and raped me for the first time. Every day for the rest of her incarceration, her captor would assault her many times. However, out of respect for Katie, we will not cover any of her future assaults. I was able to keep the TV on all the time. I saw on the television that the police had figured out where the call had originated. They were aware that it had been pre-recorded. Based on this evidence, the police developed a few assumptions about Katie's whereabouts. We still had unanswered questions. Meanwhile, Katie was able to hear the testimonies of each of her family members by watching the news, beginning with Marilyn, her birth mother. Only my door to the back. I think I sobbed a lot when I saw Marilyn on the news because I could tell in her eyes that she missed me and wanted me to be found. That gave me some solace and hope. Her mother was certain that Linda and Sal were responsible for the kidnapping because they had abandoned her cause. Katie was taken into custody after she filed allegations against Sal for sexual abuse. Our main worry is that we find this child alive and well. I was enraged when Sal, my godmother's husband, appeared on the news and stated that he wanted me found. If anyone had a reason to be kidnapped or murdered, it was he, who was facing major criminal charges for sexual abuse. But Verone wasn't so eager to jump to conclusions since he had grounds to believe that Marilyn was not only the perpetrator, but that she may have attempted to frame someone else for her supposed crime. Katie's mother, Marilyn Beers, and her younger brother John were aware of what was going on with her, and there was enough reason for them to stage an abduction only to get her out of a difficult circumstance. They could walk her out, have Katie make the phone call, tape record it, and leave John Esposito clutching the luggage. The probe into the family members ran thin after a while. Each of them had good alibis, and no evidence was located at any of their homes. So the cops began investigating the last individual on the list, the most implausible suspect. The investigators tracked down John Esposito's footsteps, but it took us 30 minutes to an hour to completely explain and comprehend. We got a search warrant and conducted a thorough investigation of John Esposito's home, but there was no proof of a crime. The background check arrived the next day and was exceedingly suspicious. They discovered the grim reality about Big John after contacting the Big Brother Big Sisters Association, which the suspect proudly claimed to be a member of. John Esposito portrayed himself as a Big Brother figure. The detectives discovered that he attempted to join that group and conducted a background check on him. We discovered that he was engaged in the kidnapping of a 7-year-old child 15 years before Katie's disappearance, and he was introduced as a big brother. We were putting pressure on him and followed him wherever he went. This drew the attention of the media, who began to snoop around his house. Esposito's property was searched, both the main house and the converted garage out back where he actually lived. I was aware that Esposito was the prime suspect. I noticed that the media was camped out in front of his house. And if you haven't already guessed, the kidnapper was John Esposito, or Big John. Katie's best friend had been planning and scheming all along until the day he finally kidnapped her. Big John was perhaps the last person I could have imagined hurting me in this way. Katie was relieved when the police finally got it straight. But at this point, Ferron lacks evidence to indict Esposito and even work. Of course, he had no idea what he had done with Katie. They were getting more convinced by the day that what we were going to find was not living Katie Beers, but a body of Katie Beers. Katie awoke in the dungeon a few days later. Esposito had attached a chain on my neck. I had discovered that the key I had grabbed was for the padlock, so I was able to release myself before unattaching it. I'd count how many links were at the end of it and all the way up to the wall. When she heard Esposito approaching, she hastily chained herself up in the very same way he did, although this happened less and less because the police, certain that he was responsible for her disappearance, nearly never left him alone. Instead, they maintained an extremely close eye on him and his home, and Verone even went inside to question him. Very shocked and anxious that Jonas Esposito was involved in her kidnapping, Esposito, out of choices, began making desperate appeals to Katie. But the tiny girl knew better. "Let's make the cops believe you're dead. Play dead, and I'll photograph you. When the cops see that, they'll give up on you." Katie, the bright little girl, the intelligent little girl, realized that could be her death sentence, and she refused to pretend dead and let him photograph her. I didn't sleep much after that, and I didn't eat any of the food that he may have changed because I was afraid he'd put anything in it, like a sedative or a sleeping pill. So he was able to capture the shot he desired, and the police stopped looking for me. Katie then resolved to confront him, bombarding him with questions in the hopes of convincing him of the irrationality of his conduct. How I was going to go to school, what I was going to do to survive, and how I wanted to get married and have children. And he'd constantly respond with humorous quips like, "Oh, you'll have kids with me, you'll marry me, you'll do this with me." So I'd constantly say, "No, I don't want to do that." I was appalled. I was 10 years old at the time. I was attempting to persuade him to consider the long-term consequences of kidnapping me. Between the enormous police presence, Ferrone's persistent tailing, and Katie's constant nagging and questioning, Esposito began to crack. He told her that he was preparing to either end his life or flee. She knew if she let it happen, he'd either kill her or abandon her in the dungeon. I told him I was sick and didn't feel good. I suppose the police department laying on him all the time at his house, together with my queries, and then me stating I wasn't feeling well, finally wore him down. As a result, the pressure is increasing. He ultimately consults with his lawyer. He informs me, "I have something very important to tell you. I know where Katie is," and the lawyer asks, "What do you mean?" He says she's behind the wall, and this is when Verone and everyone else involved in the case realized that John Esposito wasn't your typical kidnapper, but an actual mastermind. Esposito escorted police and the district attorney through all the steps of unearthing the dungeon, and police watched incredulously as he went through this 30-plus step process of revealing the dungeon that he had built. There was a bookshelf with wheels on it and you. Then you descend about 7 feet into this underground cavern, where there is a corridor, and as you crawled, you fell into this underground cell where Katie was being held. This entire romance had apparently been planned for years before he took her. I realized I'd been playing in this underground dungeon as it was being developed, so he had this concept of creating an underground dungeon, and the vision he had was expressly to kidnap me. Katie couldn't believe what was happening to her when Verone finally broke in. When the door opened, there stood a man I didn't recognize, and I remember them telling me, "We're the cops, you're safe now." I was simply ecstatic. She was still alive. "Katie, how are you doing?" Verone was also taken aback, but for a different reason. We were astounded. You observe a 9-year-old girl who appears to have just returned from the movies. She's sitting on the sofa, lively and upbeat, and we knew right away that she was going to be a survivor. Katie, now in the hands of the cops, eventually confessed the truth about what had happened. A U.S. Post kid and a State Post kid, on the other hand, never did. Everything had been disclosed to John Esposito. Esposito was convicted of first-degree kidnapping and sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. Not only did the investigator save her from Esposito, but he also discovered all the cruelty she had undergone at the hands of those who were supposed to care for her and chose to place her in foster care. When I was rescued from captivity, I went into foster care, which saved my life. I had a mother, a father, and brothers and sisters. It was simply incredible. They also pursued legal action against her Uncle Sal and successfully imprisoned him. Katie will be eternally thankful to Veron for saving her in more ways than one. I was his life for 17 days. He was one of the few that did not give up, and I am happy for the friendship I have with him. After everything was over, I wrote Katie a letter. Dear Catherine, I don't know you very well, but what I do know shows you to be a fantastic young woman with a tremendous will to live. My only wish is that we could have found you sooner and that you didn't have to spend so much time down there. Many adults would not be able to endure or survive what you went through. Continue to be strong and proud. I am confident in your abilities. She was a true survivor in the end, unwilling to let her history define her. Instead, she accomplished all she had wished for. My life is just what I had hoped for. 2 parents that adore me, a husband, 2 children, and a lovely family. I'm in tears. He attempted to entrap and exploit her, but she was able to free herself. She is now a best-selling author who volunteers with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. The finest part of my tale is understanding that you can recover and persevere, and that your life is entirely what you make it. She wants every abuse survivor to realize that they are more than what occurred to them. I was resolved not to carry my childhood tragedies into adulthood. They have shaped me, but they do not define me.